They grew up in palaces, played in gardens where stolen art lined the walls, called Hitler Uncle Fritz, had picnics at concentration camps, and thought the screaming from the barracks was just wind. Then, May 8th, 1945 arrived. The Third Reich collapsed. Nuremberg trials began, and suddenly, these privileged children of the Nazi elite found themselves with the most toxic surnames on Earth. What happened next splits them into two camps. Some doubled down on defending monsters. Others spent decades trying to kill their fathers all over again. If you value documented historical research like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual. Using sources from Norbert and Stefan Leber's My Father's Keeper interviews conducted 40 years apart, revealing how Nazi children grappled with their inheritance, and Gerald Posner's Hitler's Children, documenting rare interviews with the offspring of the Reich's inner circle. These are primary sources that took decades to compile because most of these children refused to speak publicly. Now back to the information. The numbers tell the story. Heinrich Himmler had one legitimate daughter. Hermann Göring had one daughter. Rudolph Hess had one son. Hans Frank had 5 children. Martin Bormann had 10 children. Josef Mengele had one son. Albert Speer had 6 children. By 1946, these 40-plus Nazi children faced a choice that would define the rest of their lives. Deny everything and defend Dad. Or admit the truth and live with the horror. Gudrun Himmler chose loyalty. Born August 8, 1929, she was Heinrich Himmler's little doll. He called her Puppy. She called him Poppy. In 1941, when she was 12, Himmler took Gudrun to Dachau concentration camp. She wrote in her diary, "We saw everything we could. We saw the gardening work. We saw the pear trees. We saw all the pictures painted by the prisoners. Marvelous. And afterward we had a lot to eat. It was very nice." 30,000 people died at Dachau. Gudrun saw flower beds. When the Allies captured them in May 1945, Gudrun was 15. British interrogators showed her photographs of corpses stacked like cordwood. Asked her point blank, "Do you know how many people your father cremated at Dachau, or how many he gassed at Oranienburg?" "Of course you do. You're Herr Himmler's daughter, after all." She sat silent, never answered. When Himmler bit down on his cyanide capsule in British custody on May 23, 1945, Gudrun refused to believe he killed himself. She claimed the British murdered him. For the next 73 years, until her death on May 24, 2018, Gudrun Himmler Burwitz never wavered. She married Wolf Dieter Burwitz, a far-right propagandist who became an official in the extremist National Democratic Party. They had 2 children, from 1961 to 1963, using a false name. She worked as a secretary for West Germany's Foreign Intelligence Service. When they discovered her real identity, they fired her immediately. But her real work was just beginning. Gudrun became the godmother of Stille Hilfe, Silent Help. Founded in 1951 by Princess Helene von Eisenberg, Silent Help existed to aid fugitive SS members. They called Gudrun the Nazi princess. She helped Klaus Barbie, the Butcher of Lyon, escape to South America. She arranged expensive nursing home care for Anton Malloth, who baked at least 100 prisoners to death at Theresienstadt, including the grandfather of German-Jewish journalist Peter Finkelgruen. When German taxpayers ended up funding Malloth's care through social services, the public scandal was enormous. Gudrun didn't care. She also supported Klaus Karl Faber, a convicted Dutch Nazi who had fled to Germany. At meetings like the annual Ulrichsburg gathering in Austria, Gudrun appeared as both star and authority figure. Neo-Nazi women's groups revered her. She attended memorials for war criminals. When she died at 88 Towers, her grave location was kept secret to prevent it becoming a Nazi shrine. Oliver Schramm, who wrote a book about Silent Help, called her a flamboyant Nazi princess. A German domestic security official said in 2015, "She has a genuine love for these men and women who served the worst parts of the Nazi regime from 1933 to 1945. She is a true believer, and like all zealots, that makes her dangerous." This is where we see the first division. While Gudrun Himmler defended mass murderers, other Nazi children went in completely different directions. Martin Bormann Jr. took the most dramatic path. Born Adolf Martin Bormann on April 14, 1930 in Grunwald, Bavaria, he was the oldest of Martin Bormann's 10 children and Hitler's godson. His father controlled access to Hitler. By 1943, Bormann Sr. was the second most powerful man in the Reich. Martin Jr. was raised as Crown Prince. They called him Kronzi, short for Kronprinz. He attended the Nazi Party Academy at Matre am Brenner in Tyrol from 1940 to 1945. When the academy closed on April 15, 1945, 15-year-old Martin found himself stranded in Salzburg with false identity papers. A Catholic farmer named Nicholas Hohenwarter gave him shelter at the Kirleitnerhof, halfway up a mountain in the Salzburg Alps. In March 1946, Martin's mother, Gerda, died of cancer in an Allied prison hospital. The next year, Martin learned about her death from a newspaper article. Only then did he confess his true identity to his protector. The local priest took him to the Church of Maria Kirchtal. American intelligence officers arrested him there and held him for several days of interrogation at Zell am See before returning him to the parish. Martin converted to Catholicism. On July 26, 1958, he was ordained a priest with the Missionaries of the Sacred Heart in Ingolstadt. In 1961, Father Martin was sent as a missionary to the newly independent Congo. He had to flee in 1964 due to the Simba Rebellion. He returned for another year in 1966. After a near-fatal injury in 1969, a nun named Cordula nursed him back to health. They fell in love. Both renounced their vows and married in 1971. They had no children. Martin became a theology teacher and retired in 1992. As late as 2001, he toured German and Austrian schools, speaking about the horrors of the Third Reich. He even visited Israel and met with Holocaust survivors. On August 16, 1999, Martin scattered his father's ashes in the Baltic Sea. Time magazine called the story Father's Failure. Adolf Hitler's brutal deputy, Martin Bormann, was notorious for his hatred of religion, took particular care that none of my children gets depraved and diseased by the poison of Christianity. He failed completely. But Martin Bormann Jr.'s story has a dark coda. In 2011, he was accused by a former pupil at an Austrian Catholic boarding school of rape. The alleged victim said Bormann raped him as a 12-year-old boy when Bormann was working as a priest and schoolmaster in the early 1960s. Martin Bormann Jr. died on March 11, 2013, at age 82 in Herdecke, Germany. The pattern holds. Some chose complete rejection of their father's legacy. Others doubled down on defense. Wolf Rudiger Hess spent his entire life trying to clear Rudolph Hess of war crimes. Born November 18, 1937, Wolf lived with his parents until his father's flight to Scotland on May 14, 1941, when Wolf was 3 years old. After Rudolph Hess parachuted into Scotland, claiming he wanted to negotiate peace with Britain, Hitler declared him mentally ill and ordered his name removed from all Nazi records. Wolf's mother, Ilse, moved with her son to Bad Oberdorf, a small spa village in the Allgäu Alps. The boy earned the lifelong nickname Buzz. On June 3, 1947, Ilse Hess was arrested by Allied forces along with the wives of other Nuremberg defendants and interned at Augsburg-Göggingen camp. Wolf lived with an aunt until his mother's release in March 1948. His father was sentenced to life imprisonment at Spandau Prison in Berlin. Wolf began studying architecture in the mid-1950s and qualified as an architect in 1961. But his real career was defending his father. In 1956, Wolf founded the Committee to Free Rudolph Hess. The movement gained hundreds of thousands of supporters, including prominent German politicians. He wrote 3 books: My Father Rudolph Hess in 1986, Who Murdered My Father, Rudolph Hess in 1989, and Rudolph Hess, I Regret Nothing in 1994. Wolf visited his father regularly in Spandau. When Rudolph Hess was found dead in his cell on August 17, 1987, or age 93, having hanged himself with an extension cable, Wolf immediately claimed murder. He insisted the British Secret Intelligence Service killed his father to prevent him from revealing embarrassing information about British misconduct during the war. Documents released in 2009 proved Wolf wrong. The British actually wanted to release Rudolph Hess on humanitarian grounds, but Soviet opposition kept him imprisoned. Wolf was immensely pleased when his grandson, Wolf Andreas Hess, was born on April 20th, Hitler's birthday. At age 63, Wolf Rudiger Hess suffered a stroke and died on October 24th, 2001. He left a widow and 3 children. The most brutal confrontation between Nazi child and Nazi father happened in Brazil in 1977. Rolf Mengele, son of Joseph Mengele, the Angel of Death, flew to São Paulo to confront his father about Auschwitz. Joseph Mengele had been hiding in South America since 1949. The Mengele family business in Günzburg sent him $100 to $170 a month to survive. Rolf, born in 1944, barely knew his father. They had met only once, during a ski holiday in Switzerland in 1956, when Rolf was told the man was his Uncle Fritz. By 1977, Rolf was a 33-year-old lawyer who had spent years arguing with his father through letters about the war. Fed up with written arguments, he decided to confront Joseph face to face. Using his real passport, Rolf flew Varig Airlines to Rio de Janeiro. then took 3 different taxis to Sao Paulo. The final destination was 55555 Alvarenga Road, a dusty potholed street in a poor section of the city. The property looked more like a hut than a house. Joseph Mengele, now 65, was living with an Austrian couple, Wolfram and Lieselotte Bossert, under the false identity of Wolfgang Gerhard. When father and son embraced, Rolf felt he was meeting a stranger. The man who greeted him with tears in his eyes was a broken creature, a shadow of Uncle Fritz from 21 years earlier. Mengele graciously gave Rolf his bed while he slept on the floor. For 14 days, they talked. Rolf adopted a conciliatory but lawyerly approach, letting his father state his case before cross-examining him. Joseph Mengele was mentally alert and spoke Latin and Greek fluently. He was also depressed, suffered mood swings, and talked about suicide. But on Auschwitz, he remained completely unrepentant. He claimed he had to do his duty, to carry out orders, and that he had not invented Auschwitz. Mengele told his son that the selections were like battlefield triage in a military hospital, where doctors had to make instant decisions about who to save and who to let die. People were arriving infected with disease, half dead, he said, claiming he saved as many people as possible by selecting them for work details. He even claimed that twins in the camp owed their lives to him, and that he personally had never harmed anyone in his life. When Rolf showed incredulity, Mengele became angry and still spoke of his victims as worthless lives. Rolf left Brazil disgusted by his father's lack of remorse. 2 years later, on February 7, 1979, Joseph Mengele suffered a stroke while swimming at a beach resort near Bertioga, Brazil. He drowned and was buried under the false name Wolfgang Gerhard. Rolf knew about his father's death immediately but kept silent for 6 years. In June 1985, when German police raided the home of family friend Hans Sedlmayr and found letters revealing Mengele's location, Brazilian authorities exhumed the body. Rolf finally admitted publicly that his father was dead. He said, "All victims and their relatives have my and our deepest sympathy." But when asked if he would have betrayed his father to authorities, Rolf said, "I would never betray my father. No one in the world can ask me to do that." If you value documented historical research like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support our work. Also comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual, using sources from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum's Oral History Archive, featuring Niklas Frank's 2016 interview, and the Liber father and son research spanning 40 years of interviews with Nazi children. Now back to the information. The most savage rejection of a Nazi father came from Niklas Frank. Born March 9, 1939, he was the youngest of Hans Frank's 5 children. His father was the Butcher of Poland, Governor General of occupied Poland, directly responsible for the deaths of millions of Jews and Poles. Niklas was 7 years old when Hans Frank was executed by hanging at Nuremberg on October 16, 1946. But Hans Frank had already rejected his youngest son. He suspected Niklas was actually the child of Karl Lasch, the governor of Galicia and a close friend. Niklas was closer to his nanny Hilda than to his father. Niklas spent his early childhood at Wawel Castle in Krakow, living like a prince while mass murder occurred kilometers away. He remembered visiting the Krakow ghetto with his mother, nurse, and chauffeur, but didn't understand what he was seeing. I was surprised because of all the sad people around, and the sad children my age who were walking around or just staring at me, he recalled. After the war, the family plunged into poverty. But former Nazis who recognized Niklas as the son of the innocent Hans Frank would give him money and meals. It was really great when they found out that I was the son of this mass murderer, he said. In 1987, Niklas published Der Vater, eine Abrechnung, the father, a settling of accounts, translated into English as In the Shadow of the Reich in 1991. The book was first serialized in Stern magazine and caused massive controversy in Germany. Niklas called his father a slime hole of a Hitler fanatic and questioned whether his supposed deathbed conversion to Catholicism was genuine. He regretted that a 1944 assassination attempt on Hans Frank had failed. Niklas wrote that every night he would execute both parents anew in his imagination. 40 years after his father's execution, he wrote, "The snapping of your neck spared me from having a totally screwed up life. You certainly would have poisoned my brain with all your drivel." The fate of the silent majority of my generation who did not have the good fortune to have had their fathers hanged. But he continued, "There has never been a day in my life when you didn't pop up inside my brain with that little piggy bat snout of yours." Niklas has built a monument in his garden depicting a giant crocodile tear, dedicated to Jewish children, women and men who died in the Holocaust. He travels to schools warning that Germany is in danger of returning to its Nazi past. The situation right now in my mind in Germany is horrible. he said in 2024. When asked in a documentary if his own daughter was ashamed of her grandfather, she replied, "No, you are my fortress. You've defeated him for me." Of Niklas Frank's 4 siblings, all were damaged by their father's legacy. Norman became an alcoholic. Sigrid emigrated to South Africa because she liked apartheid and became addicted to tranquilizers. Michael developed an addiction to milk so severe his wife couldn't save enough for their children, leading to obesity and organ failure. Brigitte committed suicide in 1981 at age 46. Niklas claims she killed herself because she didn't want to become older than their father, who was executed at age 46. Niklas is the only survivor of Hans Frank's children. The daughter who defended her father longest was Eda Göring. Born June 2nd, 1938, she was the only child of Hermann Göring and his actress wife Emmy Sonnemann. Eda was called the Shirley Temple of Nazi Germany. Hitler was her godfather. She received 600,000 congratulatory messages when she was born. Life magazine put her on the cover. Her baptism presents included 2 paintings by Lucas Cranach the Elder, gifts from the city of Cologne. She grew up at Karen Hall, the Göring estate filled with looted art worth millions. As a child, she had her own miniature playhouse and a private cinema. When Hermann Göring committed suicide with cyanide on October 15th, 1946, the night before his scheduled execution, Eda was 8 years old. She and her mother were imprisoned at Straubing camp during the Nuremberg trials. After their release, they lived in poverty in a small Munich apartment. Eda worked as a law clerk and later as a medical secretary. She remained devoted to her father's memory. "My only memories of him are such loving ones," she told journalist Gerald Posner in 1991. "I cannot see him any other way." She downplayed her father's role in the Holocaust despite clear historical evidence of his central involvement. "My father's problem was his loyalty to Hitler," she said. "The things that happened to the Jews were horrible, but quite separate from my father." In the 1970s, Eda became the companion of Stern magazine journalist Gerd Heidemann, who had bought Hermann Göring's former yacht, Karen II. On the ship, they entertained former Nazi generals like Karl Wolff and Wilhelm Mohnke. For 15 years, Eda fought legal battles to recover artworks given to her as baptism gifts. She won several cases in the 1950s, but lost the final appeal to Germany's Federal Court of Justice in 1968. In 2014, at age 76, she petitioned Bavarian authorities to return her father's looted art collection, arguing she needed the money to support herself. The local parliament rejected her request after only a few minutes of discussion. Eda Göring died on December 21st, 2018 at age 80. She was buried in an unmarked grave in Munich to prevent Nazi pilgrimages. The contrast is stark. 4 paths emerged for the children of SS leaders. Some, like Gudrun Himmler, became active Nazi defenders, using their inherited status to aid war criminals and fund neo-Nazi movements. Others, like Hess, spent their lives trying to rehabilitate their fathers, reputations through books, petitions, and conspiracy theories. A third group, like Eda Göring and Rolf Mengele, maintained personal loyalty while privately acknowledging their father's crimes. They refused to betray family bonds even when they found the actions reprehensible. The 4th path, taken by Niklas Frank and Martin Bormann Jr., involved complete rejection and public condemnation of their fathers' legacies. The numbers matter. Of Heinrich Himmler's children, Gudrun defended him to her death, while her half-siblings Helge and Nanette, born to his mistress Hedwig Potthast, avoided publicity entirely. Of Martin Bormann's 10 children, 9 converted to Catholicism. Only one, Gerda, named after her mother, refused. Of Hans Frank's 5 children, 4 were destroyed by their inheritance through addiction, exile, and suicide. Only Niklas survived by rejecting everything his father represented. Rudolph Hess had 1 son who spent his life defending a war criminal. Hermann Göring had 1 daughter who died, maintaining her father was a good man caught in bad circumstances. Josef Mengele had 1 son who confronted the truth but refused to betray blood. The generational impact continues today. Gudrun Himmler's children have remained completely silent about their grandfather. Wolf Hess's son Wolf Andreas was born on Hitler's birthday, a fact that pleased his father enormously. Martin Bormann Jr. had no children, deliberately ending that genetic line. Niklas Frank's daughter considers him a fortress, protecting her from her grandfather's shadow. Eda Göring had no children. Rolf Mengele had children, but kept them away from media attention. What none of them could escape was the weight of inherited guilt. Even those who rejected their fathers completely carried the psychological burden of genocidal parentage. Niklas Frank built his monument to Holocaust victims in his garden because he could never forget that children his age were being murdered while he played prince in a stolen castle. Martin Bormann Jr. spent decades in Africa trying to atone for sins he didn't commit. Gudrun Himmler created a golden image of Heinrich Himmler that bore no resemblance to historical reality because the alternative was psychological destruction. The historical record shows that most Nazi children fell into obscurity after initial post-war scrutiny. They changed names, moved cities, avoided publicity. Only a handful became public figures. Of those who spoke publicly, the divide was absolute. No middle ground existed between complete defense and complete rejection. The Nazi legacy allowed no compromise. You either embraced the monster or killed him symbolically over and over again. Recent DNA analysis has confirmed the identities of several Nazi remains, including Joseph Mengele in 1992 and Martin Bormann in 1998. These confirmations closed chapters for the children but didn't resolve their internal conflicts. Rolf Mengele scattered his father's ashes when DNA testing proved the Brazilian corpse was authentic. The symbolism was deliberate. He was literally disposing of the evidence while maintaining he would never betray his father's location when it mattered. The most chilling detail comes from Gudrun Himmler's diary entry about Dachau in 1941. At age 12, she wrote about the marvelous paintings by prisoners and the wonderful food afterward. She saw beauty where 30,000 people died horrible deaths. This wasn't propaganda or indoctrination failing. This was a child's mind protecting itself from witnessing genocide by focusing on pear trees instead of crematoriums. When British officers confronted her with photographs of corpses 4 years later, that protective mechanism was already locked in place. She would spend 73 years maintaining that mental barrier because the alternative was accepting that Poppy was history's greatest monster. The final irony is that the children who defended their fathers became the very evidence of those fathers, humanity that they were trying to preserve. Heinrich Himmler calling Gudrun every few days proves he was capable of love. Martin Bormann. Reading bedtime stories to his 10 children proves he wasn't a complete sociopath. Hermann Göring commissioning elaborate dresses for Eda proves he felt affection. Joseph Mengele writing children's stories in his Brazilian exile proves he retained some connection to innocence. But this evidence of paternal love makes their crimes even more horrifying, not less. They weren't inhuman monsters, they were human monsters. They chose evil while maintaining the capacity for love. That's what their children could never reconcile. In 2018, German domestic intelligence reported that Silent Help still operates in secret, though Gudrun Himmler's death removed its most prominent figure. Neo-Nazi groups continue to lionize the children who defended their fathers while attacking those who rejected them. Niklas Frank receives death threats for his books and speeches. This confirms that the battle for historical memory continues into the third generation. The grandchildren of SS leaders now face the same choice their parents did: defend, reject, or disappear into silence. But there's one more revelation that changes everything we thought we knew about these Nazi children. In 1999, construction workers in Berlin discovered Martin Bormann Sr.'s skull during excavation near Lehrter Station. Glass fragments in his jaw confirmed he bit down on a cyanide capsule while fleeing Hitler's bunker in May 1945. DNA testing in 1998 proved the skull belonged to Martin Bormann. His son Martin had been searching for his father's remains for 53 years, believing he might still be alive in South America. The discovery meant that, for over half a century, the most converted Nazi child had been hoping to find a man who died 2 days after Hitler's suicide. Faith can preserve innocence even in the children of monsters.